The dusty roadside diner was buzzing with loud engines and rough laughter when something unexpected caught everyone's attention that evening. A teenage girl stepped through the creaky door wearing a worn leather biker jacket that clearly looked too big for her small shoulders. The group of hardened bikers sitting by the window exchanged amused glances before one of them chuckled loudly and nudged his friend beside him. "Look at that kid trying to dress like one of us," someone muttered while the others burst into laughter across the smoky diner. She didn't react to their mocking voices and calmly walked toward the counter with quiet confidence in every step she took. The laughter only grew louder as the bikers pointed at the oversized jacket hanging awkwardly from her slim frame. One man leaned back in his chair and joked that maybe Halloween came early for little bikers tonight. Another biker whistled sarcastically and asked if her parents knew she borrowed a costume from a real writer. But while everyone laughed, nobody noticed the small patch stitched carefully on the back of her jacket yet. And that tiny patch would soon turn the entire room silent in a way nobody expected. The girl quietly ordered a simple burger and sat alone at a corner table near the dusty window. Outside, the evening sun painted long shadows across rows of rumbling motorcycles parked like steel horses resting after a long ride. The bikers kept staring at her between bites of food and sips of bitter coffee. One of them whispered loudly enough for her to hear that jackets like that had to be earned on the road. Another joked that real writers didn't come in sizes small enough to shop in the kids section. The girl calmly unzipped the jacket slightly and kept eating her meal without showing any sign of anger. That calmness somehow annoyed the bikers even more because they expected embarrassment or maybe tears. Instead, she sat there like she had heard worse things before in her life. The jukebox hummed softly in the background while tension slowly began creeping across the diner's smoky air. And still, nobody had paid close attention to the patch stitched across her back. One biker named Rick finally stood up, wiping grease-stained hands on his faded jeans while walking toward her table slowly. His heavy boots echoed across the wooden floorboards as every other biker watched the scene unfold with curiosity. Rick leaned slightly over the table with a smirk that clearly showed he expected an easy moment of intimidation. "Kid, where did you steal that jacket from?" he asked while folding his tattooed arms across his chest. The girl calmly finished her bite before lifting her eyes to meet his gaze without even blinking once. There was something steady and fearless in her stare that made Rick pause longer than he expected. But pride kept him standing there while the others waited for another joke to land. One of the bikers shouted from across the diner asking if she planned to join their club tonight. Laughter rolled across the room again while Rick casually walked behind her chair. That was the moment his eyes finally noticed the patch stitched clearly across the leather. Rick froze in place as if someone suddenly locked his muscles in solid stone. The laughter behind him slowly faded as he stared at the patch with growing disbelief. His smirk disappeared, replaced by a look that none of the other bikers had ever seen before. Someone across the diner called out asking why he suddenly looked like he saw a ghost. Rick didn't answer right away because his eyes stayed glued to the emblem on that jacket. It wasn't just any patch stitched for decoration or style like cheap biker gear sold online. The symbol carried the mark of an old legendary motorcycle club known across highways for decades. This club wasn't known for jokes or costumes but for riders who earned their place through loyalty and courage. Very few people outside the riding world even recognized the emblem anymore. But every serious biker in that room knew exactly what it meant. Rick slowly stepped back from the girl's chair as if he suddenly realized something important. The other bikers leaned forward trying to see what had made him lose his confidence so quickly. One of them squinted toward the patch while the room grew strangely quiet around them. The girl calmly wiped her hands with a napkin and leaned back in her chair like nothing unusual was happening. Rick cleared his throat before speaking, but his voice sounded very different now. "Where did you get that jacket?" he asked again, though this time without a hint of mockery in his tone. The girl looked at him calmly before answering in a steady voice that carried quiet pride. She told him the jacket belonged to someone who rode thousands of miles protecting people who couldn't protect themselves. The bikers exchanged confused looks while Rick slowly nodded like he already knew the name coming next. And then she said the name that made several chairs scrape loudly against the diner floor. "My father wore this jacket," she said softly while touching the sleeve with careful respect. The room seemed to hold its breath as the bikers processed what she had just revealed. One man whispered a name under his breath that carried serious weight among motorcycle riders everywhere. Her father had once led one of the most respected highway riding crews in the region. Stories about his courage and loyalty still traveled through biker gatherings years after he disappeared from the road. Some said he retired quietly, while others believed he died protecting a fellow rider during a dangerous trip. Nobody knew the full truth because legends often grew larger than facts over time. But one thing every biker agreed on was the deep respect carried by that club patch. Rick slowly nodded again while the realization settled across his face like heavy dust after a long ride. The girl simply sat there waiting while the room adjusted to a completely different mood. One older biker finally stood up and removed his hat slowly in silent respect. The others followed one by one as the truth spread across the diner like a quiet wave. Moments earlier they had laughed at a teenager wearing an oversized biker jacket. Now they realized they had been mocking the daughter of a man many riders still admired deeply. The girl watched them calmly, not angry but clearly used to moments like this. She explained that her father taught her that respect on the road mattered more than loud engines or shiny motorcycles. He always said a true rider protected others instead of trying to impress them. Some bikers lowered their eyes while remembering the careless jokes they made earlier. Rick stepped forward again, but this time he looked more thoughtful than intimidating. The diner had become so quiet that even the humming refrigerator behind the counter sounded loud. Rick finally spoke again, but his tone carried a mixture of respect and curiosity now. He asked the girl where her father was riding these days because many people still wondered about him. The girl hesitated slightly before explaining that her father passed away 2 years earlier after a long illness. The jacket was the one thing she kept because it reminded her of the stories he told about the road. Sometimes she wore it when she wanted to feel brave during difficult days. The bikers listened carefully while realizing how wrong their first impressions had been earlier that evening. Rick nodded slowly while glancing again at the patch that once belonged to a legendary rider. Then he did something nobody expected when the teasing first started. He pulled out a chair and sat across from her table respectfully. The tough biker who once mocked her now spoke with surprising sincerity in his voice. He told her that her father had once helped stranded riders during a dangerous snowstorm years ago. Several bikers in the diner nodded because they remembered hearing that story many times. Her father had ridden through freezing wind to guide lost motorcyclists safely back to the highway. Acts like that earned the kind of respect patches alone could never create. The girl smiled quietly while listening because she had heard many similar stories growing up. Each one reminded her that her father's legacy still lived through the people he helped. Rick leaned back in his chair and looked around at the other bikers thoughtfully. The laughter that once filled the room had completely vanished. One biker walked over and gently placed a small metal rider badge on the table near her plate. He explained that it belonged to a ride they organized every year in memory of respected riders. Nobody spoke loudly anymore because the moment had turned deeply meaningful for everyone inside that diner. The girl looked surprised but grateful as she carefully picked up the small badge. Rick told her that the road always remembered riders who lived with honor and courage. And her father clearly left tracks that many people still followed even years later. Several bikers quietly returned to their seats while the diner slowly returned to normal sounds again. But something about the atmosphere had changed forever after that conversation. The girl finished her meal while the bikers talked quietly among themselves with new respect in their voices. Some shared stories about the legendary rider whose jacket she proudly wore that evening. Others simply watched her with thoughtful expressions as if realizing lessons sometimes arrive unexpectedly. When she finally stood to leave, several bikers nodded respectfully as she passed by their tables. Rick even walked to the door and held it open for her with a polite gesture. Outside, the motorcycles glowed under the fading sunset while the wind gently lifted the edges of her jacket. She paused for a moment beside the bikes before walking toward the quiet road. The patch on her back caught the last light of the day like a silent reminder of legacy. Inside the diner, the bikers remained unusually quiet for a long moment after she left. One of them finally broke the silence by saying that respect should never be judged by age or appearance. The others nodded slowly while thinking about how quickly laughter turned into humility that evening. Rick looked down at his coffee cup before speaking softly to the group. He said the road had a strange way of teaching lessons when people least expected them. Everyone agreed that the girl carried more courage in her quiet confidence than many loud riders on the highway. And none of them would forget the moment they first noticed that patch. Stories like this remind us that the road holds deeper histories than we can see at first glance. Sometimes the quietest person in the room carries the loudest legacy behind them. Respect isn't about age, strength, or the size of someone's motorcycle engine. It's about the values they carry and the stories stitched into the paths they follow. That teenage girl walked into a diner full of bikers and left with their respect without raising her voice once. And sometimes that kind of quiet strength speaks louder than any roaring engine ever could. If this story surprised you or made you think differently about judging people too quickly, let me know your thoughts in the comments below. Don't forget to like this video if you enjoyed the story and share it with friends who love powerful unexpected moments like this. And if you want more Wild West style stories filled with suspense, respect, and unforgettable characters, make sure you subscribe to the channel and join our growing community of storytellers and listeners.